Racist cop arrests black man for stealing a luxury car, then discovers it's actually his and he's a billionaire. The afternoon sun blazed down on Officer Jeff Parker's patrol car, casting a shimmering heat wave over the quiet suburban street. Just another uneventful day, until the low growl of a black Lamborghini drifted into view, cutting through the stillness. Parker's attention sharpened instantly. A car like that. In a neighborhood like this, it didn't sit right with him. He flicked on his siren, the wail breaking the peaceful silence as he pulled out to follow. The Lamborghini slowed to a halt, smooth and controlled. Parker approached cautiously, his hand brushing the edge of his holster out of habit. The windows slid down, revealing a well-dressed black man, maybe in his late 30s, wearing sleek sunglasses that reflected the sun. His expression was calm, but something about it unsettled Parker, too calm. "License and registration," Parker said, his voice steady but with a subtle bite. He could feel tension already brewing, though he wasn't quite sure why. The man moved with deliberate ease, handing over the documents without a word. Parker scanned them briefly, noting the local address but feeling the disconnect. "You live around here?" he asked, tilting his head in a way that implied doubt. The man met his eyes evenly. "Just passing through," he replied, voice measured, as if he'd had this conversation before. Parker leaned in slightly, his curiosity tinged with suspicion. "Nice car for someone just passing through. What's your line of work?" There was an edge now, a small challenge laced beneath the question. "Business," the man said simply, his tone offering nothing more. Parker narrowed his eyes, feeling the familiar itch of doubt. "Business? That's a bit vague for a car like this." His tone held a thin veneer of professionalism, but the skepticism was impossible to hide. "You sure you're not lost?" The man raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Lost? Since when is driving a nice car through a nice neighborhood a cause for concern?" Parker felt his gut tighten. There was something about the man's confidence that made him uneasy. "Not every day you see someone like you in a vehicle like this," he said, letting the implication hang in the air. "Someone like me," the man repeated, his voice cool but edged with an unspoken challenge. Parker bristled slightly, his control over the situation slipping. He cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "Look, I'm just doing my job. You understand that, right?" The man removed his sunglasses slowly, locking eyes with Parker. "I understand your job, officer," he said evenly. "But your job shouldn't involve making assumptions about me based on how I look." A pulse of anger flickered in Parker's chest, mingling with something else, something uncomfortable. He tightened his grip on the man's documents, struggling to maintain his authority. "Let's just say I've seen things that raise red flags." "Red flags," the man said, his voice remaining calm but firm, "or just prejudices?" Parker's jaw clenched. He could feel the balance of control shifting, and it bothered him more than he cared to admit. "Stay put while I run your plates," he muttered, stepping away from the car, his mind racing as he headed back to the patrol vehicle. As he sat behind the wheel, the weight of his own assumptions pressed down on him, but he shoved the feeling aside. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to lose control, not now. But as the engine of the Lamborghini idled, Parker couldn't shake the nagging doubt creeping into the back of his mind. Officer Parker sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine barely audible beneath his racing thoughts. His fingers hovered over the computer keyboard as he typed in the Lamborghini's license plate, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. His gaze lingered on James, who stood by the sleek car with an air of calm that rubbed Parker the wrong way. Parker glanced at the screen. Clean registration, nothing unusual. Yet a prickling unease gnawed at him. He leaned back in his seat, his fingers tapping restlessly against the steering wheel. Something felt off, but it wasn't anything he could pin down. It wasn't the car, the papers, or the man himself. It was everything, the contrast. James stood still, arms crossed, waiting. There was no nervous fidgeting, no aggression, no rush to prove his innocence, just a steady calm that unnerved Parker. The officer's eyes flickered back toward James, taking in the crisp lines of his tailored suit, the quiet authority in his posture. Parker shifted uncomfortably, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off the sensation of being outclassed. He reached for his radio, then stopped, feeling a strange heat crawl up his neck. His training told him to look for signs, something out of place, something wrong. But James was giving him nothing. Instead, it was Parker who fidgeted, his fingers tracing the edge of his badge, his jaw tightening. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the sweat gathering at his temples. The man's confidence stirred something in Parker, something that made his chest tighten. A familiar feeling, but unwelcome. His father's voice echoed in his mind. "Trust your gut, son. Don't let anyone slip through." The advice felt hollow now, faced with a man who didn't fit any narrative Parker had learned. He glanced at James again. The way he stood, calm and unbothered, made Parker's stomach knot. He shifted in his seat, fingers tapping harder against the doorframe. James wasn't just standing there. He was challenging him without saying a word, and Parker could feel it, his authority slipping. The screen beeped again. No priors, no warrants, nothing but a successful black man standing by an expensive car in a neighborhood Parker had subconsciously decided he didn't belong in. The officer clenched his teeth, staring at the result, willing the system to spit out something, anything that would justify this stop. Nothing. He rubbed the back of his neck, frustration building. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was the one in control here. He was the one with the authority. But the longer James stood there, calm and unshaken, the more Parker felt his power slip away. He glanced over once more. James hadn't moved an inch, his expression unreadable but confident. Parker let out a slow breath, stepping out of the car. His boots hit the pavement with more force than necessary, a desperate attempt to reassert himself. He walked over, shoulders squared, posture stiff. "Well?" James asked, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, without a hint of concern. "Just doing my job," Parker muttered, his voice rough, laced with something defensive. He swallowed hard, fighting the growing discomfort twisting inside him. The air between Parker and James grew heavy, thick with unspoken tension as Parker stepped forward, his hand instinctively brushing the cuffs at his belt. His heart pounded in his chest, louder than it should have been, his pulse a reminder that something about this was wrong. He could feel it deep inside, but he couldn't stop. Not now. "Everything checks out," Parker muttered, his voice betraying the unease gnawing at him. He was supposed to feel in control, but instead, a slow, simmering anger rose in his chest, fueled by something he didn't fully understand. He wanted an excuse, a reason, anything to justify his growing discomfort. "But that doesn't mean I can't search your vehicle." James' expression shifted, a calm wariness replacing his earlier confidence. "Do you have probable cause for that?" His voice was measured, but it carried a weight that Parker couldn't ignore. Parker paused, his throat tightening. The words "probable cause" echoed in his head, bouncing around, mocking him. He had none. Nothing solid anyway. He could feel James's eyes on him, waiting, pushing him to justify his actions. "You just seem out of place," Parker stammered, his voice edging with frustration, struggling to mask his own uncertainty. James raised an eyebrow, a hint of disbelief creeping into his calm facade. "Out of place?" He repeated slowly, as if testing the words, "Because I'm driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood." Parker's gaze faltered for a moment, then hardened. He needed control. "Maybe because not many people like you are seen around here," he retorted, his voice sharper than he intended. There it was, unguarded, raw. James's eyes narrowed, the calm in his demeanor barely holding. "People like me?" he asked, his voice steady, though there was a quiet challenge underneath. "What exactly does that mean?" Parker felt heat rise in his face. He hadn't meant to say it like that, but he was too far in now. He had to keep pushing. "Look, I'm just being cautious," he said defensively. "You're not the typical driver we see around here." James took a small step forward, his posture still relaxed, but there was something different now. "Maybe you should look at why that is," he said softly, though his words were sharp, cutting through Parker's defenses. "What does it say about you that you can't accept someone who doesn't fit your idea of who belongs?" Parker's stomach twisted. He wanted to snap back, to regain control, but James's words hung in the air like a weight pressing down on him. He fumbled for a response, anger and insecurity battling for dominance. "I'm doing my job," Parker growled, but even as he said it, he knew the words were hollow. James shook his head slowly, his gaze never leaving Parker's. "No," he said, disappointment evident in his tone. "You're not doing your job. You're trying to justify a bias you won't even acknowledge. You know there's no reason to arrest me, and yet here we are." Parker clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. The words stung more than they should have. He felt cornered, exposed. "Maybe I should arrest you for being a nuisance," he spat, the frustration in his voice barely masked. James didn't flinch. "Under what charge?" he asked calmly, cutting through Parker's bluster with ease. Parker hesitated, the question knocking him off balance. He had no charge. He knew that. He had nothing. But admitting it felt like losing control, like giving up the authority he so desperately clung to. James took a breath, his voice calm but firm. "You can't just make up charges because you're uncomfortable. That's not how this works." The words hit Parker like a slap. His authority, his power, it all seemed to be slipping through his fingers, and the more he tried to hold on, the more it felt like sand. He could feel the weight of his own actions, the heaviness of his choices pressing down on him, but pride kept him from backing down. Without thinking, Parker reached for his handcuffs, pulling them free. "Turn around. I'm placing you under arrest," he barked, his voice louder than it needed to be, trying to regain the upper hand. "On what grounds?" James asked, his voice steady, though there was an undeniable charge behind it now. "Turn around," Parker shouted, the panic creeping into his voice, his own doubt spiraling as the situation teetered on the edge of control. James stood firm, his eyes locked onto Parker's, unwavering. "Think about what you're doing," he said quietly, but the weight of his words was impossible to ignore. For a moment, Parker hesitated. The badge on his chest felt heavy, like it was burning into his skin. The cuffs in his hand felt wrong, like a symbol of everything he didn't want to face. His heart raced, caught between the need to prove something and the gnawing feeling that he was about to make a terrible mistake. But the moment lingered, and in that pause, everything shifted. As Parker led James into the station, a knot formed in his stomach. The adrenaline from the arrest still surged through his veins, but something was gnawing at him. Doubt. The earlier confrontation had felt justified in the moment, but now, with every step, a creeping unease shadowed him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. They approached the desk officer, who was busy typing away, barely glancing up. "Name?" the officer asked, his tone flat and routine. "James Carter," James replied, his voice steady, calm, and in control. Parker barely noticed the response until he saw the desk officer freeze, fingers hovering mid-air over the keyboard. The officer's eyes darted up, widening as recognition dawned on him. He straightened in his seat, suddenly alert. "Wait, you're that James Carter." The shift in the officer's tone hit Parker like a punch to the gut. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He turned, his confusion evident. "Who the hell is James Carter?" he demanded, his voice harsher than intended, trying to maintain a grip on the situation spiraling out of his control. The desk officer swallowed hard, his complexion paling. "James Carter, the billionaire. CEO of Carter Global Industries." The words hung in the air like a loaded silence, crashing into Parker with the force of a freight train. His stomach clenched. No, this can't be right. Not this guy. Not here. But the truth, undeniable and inescapable, seeped into his brain, filling every corner with dread. He had arrested one of the richest, most influential men in the country, a man who could destroy him with a single phone call. Parker's palms grew slick with sweat, his heart pounding so loudly he thought everyone around him could hear it. His breath quickened, chest tightening. What have I done? His fingers trembled slightly as his mind replayed the events of the day, seeing each decision he had made through a new, horrifying lens. James stood silently beside him, the corners of his mouth twitching ever so slightly, as if he had expected this moment all along. There was no need for James to speak. His silence screamed louder than words ever could. Parker's throat dried, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to justify what he'd done. But there was nothing. Only the brutal truth that he had let his own assumptions guide his actions. He had let bias and misplaced authority blind him, and now he was staring down the barrel of the consequences. "Are you kidding me?" Parker muttered, his voice breaking as disbelief surged through him. His legs felt weak. His hands shook as he gripped the counter for support. The desk officer shifted uncomfortably, sensing Parker's unraveling. "Yeah, man," he said softly, looking between them. "That's him. Carter's like one of the wealthiest people in the world." Parker could barely hear the words. His mind swirled with panic, the weight of his actions pressing harder and harder. This isn't just another traffic stop gone wrong. This is a disaster. A life-altering disaster. His badge suddenly felt too heavy on his chest, a physical reminder of the authority he had just abused. His head pounded. "What have I done?" James broke the silence, his voice cool and controlled. "It's never just about the arrest, Officer Parker. It's about what led to it, the assumptions you made, the narrative you created in your mind long before I said a word." Parker blinked, his throat tightening. His chest heaved as he struggled to respond. I wasn't. The words faltered, falling flat against the cold, hard truth that was staring him in the face. James turned to look at him, eyes calm but unwavering. "You didn't arrest me because of what I did. You arrested me because of who you thought I was." Parker's breath came shallow now, sweat trickling down his back. His mind raced, searching for a defense, but each thought crumbled under the weight of shame. His hands shook visibly now, a tremor that betrayed the guilt and panic surging within him. He was unraveling. James stepped forward, his voice quiet but piercing. "The reality is your assumptions have real consequences. For me, for people like me, every day. But today, it's about you, Parker. Today, you have to live with the choices you've made." Parker's heart sank lower. He was drowning in the enormity of it all, his mind clawing for some way out. I didn't know," he stammered, the words hollow even to his own ears. James' expression softened ever so slightly, though his disappointment lingered. Not knowing isn't an excuse. It's a starting point. Parker's knees buckled slightly, and he grabbed onto the desk to steady himself. His mind whirled. This man could ruin me. He thought of his job, his reputation, the badge that now felt like a symbol of everything he'd done wrong. Sweat dripped down his temples, his throat constricting with every passing second. The desk officer, sensing the tension, quietly stepped back, leaving the two men alone in their confrontation. "You've got a choice now, Parker," James said, his voice growing more intense. "You can cling to your power, or you can face the truth." Parker swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as the words tumbled out unsteady. "I'm sorry." James nodded, his gaze steady. "Sorry isn't enough, officer. Change takes more than apologies. It takes action." Parker's head hung low, his face flushed with the realization of what he had become, a product of the very system he had sworn to uphold. But the system was broken, and today, so was he. James's words hit with finality. "You're part of something bigger than yourself. Now it's up to you to decide what you're going to do about it." For the first time, Parker didn't have an answer. Parker stood in the empty hallway outside the courtroom, staring at the ground, lost in thought. The hum of reporters and distant chatter inside barely registered. He had been summoned for a private conversation with James Carter, a meeting he couldn't escape. The door creaked open, and James stepped out, his demeanor calm but firm. Parker swallowed hard, unsure what to expect. This wasn't the same man he had thrown into the back of a squad car a few days ago. Now this was someone with the power to ruin his life, yet here he was, extending an olive branch. "Officer Parker," James said quietly, stopping just in front of him. Parker forced himself to meet his gaze, though the shame still gnawed at him. "I don't know where to start," Parker muttered, his voice low, regret weighing every word. James studied him for a moment, the silence between them heavy but not hostile. "You don't have to start with words," James replied softly. "Change doesn't begin with an apology. It begins with acknowledgement and action." Parker nodded, his throat tight. What I did was wrong. I see that now. I let my assumptions, I let them cloud my judgment." James's eyes softened slightly, though his resolve was unshaken. That's the first step. But what comes next is up to you, Parker. You've got the power to be more than just another officer who made a mistake. You could be someone who stands up and does something about it. Parker blinked, feeling the weight of James's words sink in. The guilt that had been eating at him now shifted, mingling with something else, something unfamiliar but vital. Where do I even begin? James's gaze held steady, filled with a quiet intensity. You start by listening, by learning. Then you speak up, not just for yourself, but for the people who don't have the same platform, the same opportunities. Parker's voice was barely a whisper. I don't deserve a second chance. James paused, then spoke firmly. Maybe not, but you've got one. Don't waste it. With that, James gave a brief nod and turned to leave, heading back into the courtroom. Parker stood frozen, his mind racing. He had been given an unexpected opportunity, one that could either redeem him or seal his fate. Inside the courtroom, James stepped up to the podium, a hush falling over the crowd. He glanced at the sea of faces before him, journalists, activists, curious onlookers. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about something bigger, something that had the power to ignite change. My arrest brought a lot of attention, he began, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of conviction. But today isn't about a single incident or a single officer. It's about the system that allows those incidents to happen. The crowd listened intently, but James didn't need the cameras or applause. His message was directed at the people who mattered, the ones who would carry this fight forward. There's a tendency in this country to believe that wealth or success can shield you from prejudice. I'm here to tell you that's not the case. No amount of money or status can protect you from the assumptions that are made based on the color of your skin. He paused, letting the words sink in. The air was thick with anticipation. This moment isn't about blame. It's about accountability. It's about what happens when we allow systems of inequality to persist unchecked. We all have a role in this, whether we're in positions of power, on the streets, or sitting quietly, hoping someone else will fix it. James leaned forward slightly, his voice intensifying. But change doesn't happen by waiting. It happens when we take action together. I'm calling on all of you to join me in this fight. It's not just my fight, it's our fight. The crowd stirred, energy buzzing through the room as James took a step back from the podium, his final words echoing in the quiet space. The time is now. Will you stand with me? Applause erupted, the sound washing over him, but James's gaze traveled through the crowd until it landed on Parker. The officer stood near the back, his face somber, his eyes focused intently on the man at the podium. Parker's chest tightened. He had heard plenty of speeches in his life, but this one felt different. It wasn't just about the words, it was about the truth behind them, the challenge they posed. And for the first time, Parker realized that his redemption wasn't something James could give him. It was something he'd have to earn, step by step. If this story has struck a chord, now is the time to make a difference. Support criminal justice reform. Donate to or volunteer with organizations like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and Equal Justice Initiative. Demand accountability in policing. Advocate for transparency, body cameras, and racial bias training for officers. Use your voice. Speak up when you see injustice, whether online, in your community, or at the ballot box. Educate yourself. Learn about systemic racism and challenge assumptions, because awareness is the first step toward change. Together, we can build a future where equality isn't just an idea, but a reality for everyone. Let's make that future happen today.